When I first started off this season, I was playing the Shadow Surfer. It's Shadow Bloodwave utilizing Ultimate Shadow to make Bloodwave do these crazy huge amounts of damage. You've probably seen this thing out and about somewhere. It's a very cool build. One of the biggest strengths of the build is it does an incredible amount of damage against single targets. And then on top of that, it's just something that doesn't use Bone Storm. Now, I can't stress this enough. The gameplay, it's going to be a tier 5 AOZ. I went and ran a tier 10, couldn't kill this stuff. Literally just didn't have the damage to do it. This is not meant for pushing AOZ. This is not meant to be the highest ranking Necro build in the game. It's to ask the question, what if I had the highest rank possible on Decrepify, use Dual Curse, and Shadow Bloodwave on the Curse Wave Necro? Let's go ahead and get into it. So the primary conceit of the build is the fact that Bloodwave does a whole mess ton of damage when you add on Ultimate Shadow because they've added in the keyword Desecrated Ground, and this works really well with the glyph Desecration. It's going to add a huge amount of additive damage and give you one of the biggest multipliers that you can get in a Paragon board outside of the Tears of Blood. On top of that, Bloodwave naturally synergizes with itself because it applies slow, which is something that triggers a lot of your different passives for shadow damage, and then it creates a bunch of blood orbs. Cool part about a bunch of blood orbs is that on top of fast blood means that you can rapidly reduce the cooldown of this skill. On top of that, when you have all of the monsters being crowd controlled continuously by multiple waves coming out, Flicker Step allows you to charge through them, applying your vulnerable and vampiric curse status, so you can trigger a bunch of your vampire curses, but on top of that, further reduce the cooldown. But the question that needs to be asked on a build like this, outside of like the cool damage and the effects and all of that, is literally how do you survive when you're unable to generate infinite barrier from Shielding Storm and Bone Storm? Kind of the one key ultimate skill that needs to be used on every single competitive Necromancer build. Did you ever wonder how many ranks of Decrepify you can get on your character at any given time? The cool part about Decrepify is that it reduces incoming damage from the monster, and here basically by 30% if I were to have a rank 15. That's near infinitely more valuable than any damage reduction that you may have on your character, because the damage reduction stats that you have on your character are reverse multiplicative against the total. So if I had 100% incoming damage and I have a 16% damage reduction right here, it's going to only do 84% of the damage. Okay, cool, right? But what about the next 15% of damage reduction? Well, if I were to do the math very quickly in my head, 15% of the leftover 84% of the total damage would be 8.4 plus another half, which is 4.2. So it would be 12.6 damage reduction. So 12.6 damage reduction against the 84% would leave me over with 71.4% of the damage. So you notice how you have this reverse multiplicativeness here. You're going to continue to get what you think is like smaller and smaller amounts of damage reduction. You're not completely wrong. That being said, reducing incoming damage by that amount is actually a huge total benefit. I'm not going to get lost in the weeds here. But what Decrepify says is take that 100% of the base damage, reduce that cleanly down to 70% before it hits your armor, before it hits your resistances, before it hits your damage reduction. So it is much more powerful than any damage reduction stat that you could typically have on your character. This is why the Darkness Glyph is also a very valuable amount of damage reduction, because it reduces the damage of the monster as opposed to just adding on more damage reduction for your character. So again, reducing the damage before it hits any of your resistances or any of your DR values. So it's incredibly valuable. And then if you're gonna have 14 ranks in Decrepify, what other opportunity are you ever going to have for running Dual Curse? And that's where we get the Damned Ring to finally get that 50% damage multiplier for applying both of these curses. Okay, cool. We've kind of handled our survivability, and we have the added cherry on top of adding on a damage multiplier here. Well, it goes even further. Turns out investing this much into curse skills and their passives gonna get you a really big amplified damage. Now, the moment that I apply any curse, the monsters are taking 32% additional multiplicative damage. That's a huge additional source of damage, considering we can put that on with everything else that we're gonna normally do to increase our damage further. And then what you got is an excuse to run Dual Curse and Shadow Bloodwave. And I'm not going to try to pretend to you like this build is some crazy new meta that's going to shake up the AOZ and it's going to absolutely rock all of us to our socks. It's not that good. But what it is incredibly interesting, and probably one of the most fun things I've had in trying to theory craft this, because again, at the beginning of the season, I was running Shadow Bloodwave with a big two-hander with all of that, and I wanted to ask a question like, literally, how do I make it survive AOZ? How do I make it so that it can stand toe-to-toe with some of these other builds? And while it falls a bit short it's going to offer you an opportunity to try out something a little bit different, something that isn't as cookie cutter, isn't as attached to the meta in the ways that you want. But let me just very quickly go through the planner, which I'll include in the video link down below, which I always do. If you're ever looking for it, I typically also pin it as a comment, but this is going to get added onto the Shadow Surfer for people who've been playing it or looking for ways to bring it into the AOZ in at least a pseudo-competitive format. I've tried out a couple different variations, so I went with just strictly the bad version of this, which is running a big two-hander to get the biggest damage out of Ultimate Shadow possible. And there's technically a world where you could actually do like item swapping so that you use this for single targets and against the Bloodseekers, and then you use the good version to actually survive and make it all the way through the AOZ. I would recommend just sticking along with this one, but let's very quickly go through the gear, the stats, the Paragon, and then the Vampiric Powers and the Book of the Dead, so you have everything that you need if you don't want to just click through to the build planner. So obviously, we're using Shaco. You don't need to use Shaco here. I do think that's the best option just because it has that additional damage reduction on it. You could just as easily be using a legendary helmet that's going to get you the 4 ranks to Decrepify that we're looking for. It's going to get you that huge amount of additional armor, the same amount of cooldown reduction, and then a little bit less maximum life. And then this is where you could actually drop your Exploiter's Glyph to get not only the stronger crowd control duration, but the moment that monsters get really pissed off because you've corpse tendrils them 3 times in a row, they're going to become unstoppable, and it gives you a huge amount of additional damage multiplier here that might help to kind of squeeze out 1 or 2 additional ranks in the AOZ if you're really looking to push on this thing. Disobedience is a must-have along with max life, total armor, and 2 forms of damage reduction. On the gloves, these are kind of interesting. You really don't want crit chance here, but there's kind of nothing else that you could realistically run. Maybe intelligence, maybe all stats. But then lucky hit chance, attack speed, and then shadow damage over time. And the reason why we need this gear slot, because we have to fit titles somewhere. That's how we're going to get the 3 different blood waves so that they continue to stack on top of one another, stacking even more damage over time, making it so that the next blood wave can be triggered from an attack that has already done damage in an AoE, so that our vampire powers are stronger, as well as gaining the desecration glyph bonus of that 15% damage multiplier. For the pants, oddly enough, I did try running this as like a dual shadow, dual blood overpower build with Rathmas, because initially I wasn't even using the blighted aspect. And you do very powerful overpower damage when you actually use these pants. But what we're more so looking for is like the total ranks to curse skills, as well as ranks to amplify damage, because that amplified damage is obviously going to be a great multiplier. The curse skills is going to get us that huge bonus to decrep. But then you also get a unique damage reduction stat in the form of damage reduction versus cursed targets, meaning that you can apply damage reduction to targets outside of the close or shadowed range for a little bit of survivability there. Ultimately, what I think you end up running is like any good set of pants that are actually going to have like maximum life, DR, and then armor or ranks to corpse explosion, which is a pretty nice little secondary option for us to be able to deal damage in case Blood Wave isn't off of cooldown, or we're just looking to consume even more corpses for an aspect I'll show you in just a second. Obviously, you are going to need Flicker Step because Flicker Step is effectively how we manage all of our cooldown. Now, we're also using Fast Blood to be able to reduce it in that way, but Flicker Step is definitely the fastest way, considering that you can use this like as you're engaging into combat before any corpses have been consumed or any blood orbs have been made by the blood wave itself. For the wand, I went back and forth between a wand and Black River. Black River has some additional benefits in the fact that it'll consume corpses even faster, add on additional multipliers for our corpse explosion damage, but I just found that I need to get Blighted back onto the build in an opportunity or in an effort to be able to push an AOZ. Turns out for tier 5 AOZ, you basically don't even have Blighted triggered by the time even the Bloodseekers are dying. That being said, on higher tiers, I definitely felt the lack of damage here. So Blighted on the wand, or just toss on Black River and then go do all the content that you want, because it'll be absolutely nutty with all of your overstacked like damage over time effects here. All stats, intelligence, damage over time, and then vulnerable. Damage over time is important because that's going to double dip into our Shadow Blight multiplier, as well as increasing our primary source of damage, but damage to close also works here. For the amulet, I gotta be honest with you, like the pure meme of the amplified damage and the curse is probably a little bit too much here. Definitely feel free to swap out ranks of amplify for gloom as a much better multiplier overall, but the ranks to amplify, damage reduction, total armor, and curse. And then here's where we're putting ultimate shadow. Unlike with Bone Storm, where the damage from Ultimate Shadow really doesn't matter, the damage here is our primary damage output. While the skill itself is going to do some damage on impact, that's almost completely irrelevant. compared to the desecrated ground damage. So while we would want to have this on a 2-hander, we obviously can't put that onto the build and also manage to survive in any meaningful way. So putting it onto your amulet is absolutely the best way to get the most damage out of the aspect possible, since that's the base damage we're going to scale everything else off of. For the ring, we're using Damned as well as Fast Blood. We would like to get maximum life, lucky hit chance, and then shadow damage and damage over time as our best additive damage sources here. The Fast Blood is going to be great since we're also using Embalmer for even more blood orbs, and we're using Corpse Tendrils for even more blood orbs. So being able to reduce cooldowns without having to dash into a pocket of enemies is great. And even using them both in concert, like being able to cast Blood Wave, dash through them, and as you're dashing through them, picking up blood orbs, meaning the moment that you get out the other side, you can immediately cast it again. It's one of the few ways of stacking on and actually scaling our overall damage. So I don't think that it's overkill. Whereas previously in like Nightmare Dungeons, it definitely was overkill because everything was kind of dead before we could do anything. In Abattoir of Zir, you definitely need that much more additional damage and cooldown to be able to stack as many blood waves as possible. And then lastly, the shield. And I gotta be honest with you, this shield right here is pretty cool. We basically have this exact shield in the real game. I don't even know when I created this thing, if I'm going to be honest with you. I just happened to find it in my inventory. I was clearly using this for some kind of blood build, and that's what inspired me to try any of this, because I was like, oh, I actually have a shield with enough survivability on it and perfect cooldown reduction to be able to make this work. So I just wanted to like real quick flex about that. I very typically do not have perfect gear in game or anywhere near it, and that one piece of gear I was like, oh hell yeah, this is a trophy piece. But cooldown reduction, damage reduction, resistance is actually incredibly important on the shield option here because we're going to need that to actually cap out our res so we can stack on enough armor in the base build for disobedience to get us up to the armor cap. And then lastly, the damage reduction from shadowed. And then here's where we're putting Embalmer. Again, Embalmer is going to help to generate even more blood orbs. I found often that I didn't really have anything to do. Like once you cast both of your curses, and after you cast Blood Wave, there's not a meaningful animation that you can do to actually reduce the cooldown of Flicker Step. So I find that casting Corpse Explosion during this to be able to generate more blood orbs not only gives me something valuable to be doing, adds on damage, but then actually warrants the inclusion of Embalmer for reducing our cooldowns further through Fast Blood. Skill tree is going to be pretty simple. We basically just need to get down to the next rank of skills. So 3 points with Hewed Flesh and then 3 random dump points throughout the rest of the tree. We're going to be putting our dump points into Blood Mist just to reduce that cooldown even further. While we do have Decrepify, monsters are either already dead or we're kind of fighting for our life, and we can't really rely on this for cooldown reduction. It helps a little bit, but it's not super impactful here. So we want to be able to generate corpses. We want this cooldown as low as possible since this is kind of our get out of jail free button since we do not have barrier gen typically. Going at max rank for Corpse Explosion with Blighted to be able to add on even more damage, the 3 points down into Feud Death. Then obviously we're picking up Death's Embrace, maxing out Amp, maxing out Decrep. We only need the 1 point into Iron Maiden. We don't get any additional benefits out of this. And in fact, we don't even pick up Abhorrent or Horrid since they don't really do anything for us. You could take 1 point out of Blood Mist to make it so that when you kill monsters, you heal. That's not nothing. It would be slightly more impactful if we were using Temerity, which would actually be a pretty decent option for being able to get barrier back onto this build, especially with all of our blood orbs. So if you're at home screaming that at the screen, I hear you, it's not a bad option. I'm just looking to get the strongest total curses here because if I'm going to play a meme build, I might as well go all the way through with it. Then just the 1 point into Corpse Tendrils, you can either keep Plagued for the vulnerable or you can go up to Blighted for the additional blood orbs. I gotta be honest with you, I'm not married to one or the other. If you're not using Embalmer, I would definitely recommend Blighted, but this might be a little bit of overkill. It might be too many blood orbs being generated and not actually getting any additional benefits. But again, if you're using Temerity for barrier, I would definitely go with the blood orbs here just for that better survivability. Maxing out the 2 skills that matter here for the passives, obviously Blood Wave all the way through, Memento Mori as well as Standalone, and then obviously Shadow Blight. I'm not going to go over the Paragon in excruciating detail because you're going to have the build planner yourself. You can take a look at it. But basically, we want to be near maxing out Desecration or maxing it out, depending on how you build out your board. I like the addition of Scourge as well as getting a little bit of additional points here. Building into a min benefit for Darkness, just get that additional damage reduction. And then obviously the Tears of Blood in Flesh Eater, still picking up a little bit of additional armor. And then Sacrificial in the main board, so we can max out our armor as much as possible as well and pick up additional resistances down here. For the Vampiric Powers, this one's obviously going to be pretty simple, but Anticipation on this version of an Ultimate Shadow build is actually actually so much better, since the additional targets taking damage over time is going to further increase your Blood Wave's damage. While that, again, only impacts the initial damage, it's not nothing, but the ultimate cooldown reduction is obviously phenomenal. We are using Metamorphosis because obviously you are, but it's even more important for Metamorphosis since we're going to be applying our Vampiric Curse through Prey on the Weak to be able to trigger Flowing Veins, because ultimately all the monsters are going to be crowd controlled. So if they're not moving, you don't typically benefit from Flowing Veins. So being able to dash through them with the Flicker step to apply the Vulnerable and the Vampiric Curse to get your Flowing Veins active is the best way to get the most damage out of it. And then the moment that Corpse Tendrils pulls everything in, you get an additional 24% damage multiplier through Domination. It also helps to clear up trash a little bit faster because, again, on this version of the build, we really can't trigger Decrepify all that often. So the faster everything is dead, the better. For your own personal Book of the Dead, this is going to look a little bit different depending on your gear. If you are willing to either drink a magic resist potion or an armor potion, you can run it the way that I'm currently showing it right now. We don't really benefit from any of the other potions in a meaningful way. We're not really a lucky hit build. We don't care about crit or crit chance or anything like that. We're not overpowering. So just being able to either drink the Iron Skin potion for the armor, or being able to stack the magic resist potion so we don't have to worry about that, will allow you to sacrifice Reapers for the additional shadow damage, sacrificing Cold for the additional vulnerable damage, and then here we actually don't want Iron. We're typically either going to go with Blood just for more survivability, or a little bit spicier Bone for the additional increased attack speed. I'm going to leave it on Blood just because I think people are going to need the most help with survivability as possible here. There you go. Curse Wave, Shadow Blood Wave, but with dual Curse, Damned Wave, whatever you want to call it. It doesn't really matter. I'm going with Curse Wave just because that kind of has a clean tang to it, but it's an interesting build. Again, I don't think that's like particularly overwhelmingly powerful. It's definitely one of the more interesting ways to play the build. Being able to rely on different sources of damage reduction as opposed to only using Bone Storm is probably its like key takeaway or like key selling point here. So if you're looking to try something different, don't bork your build. Get a new set of gear, put it together, run it with this. Let me know what you think. I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. If you haven't already, subscribe to the channel. I'd super appreciate that. Go ahead and leave a like on the video as well if you're either inspired to try something like this yourself or you just generally enjoy the content. It's the best way to tell YouTube that we got something cool going on here and it should show it off to the other nerds in the community. But as always, thank you so much for watching this video. I truly hope that it helps, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.